Leipzig, 1865. A dusty bookstore. A 21-year-old, thin, intense young man with truly hungry eyes leafs through a thick, dark-covered book. The title, The World as Will and Representation author, Arthur Schopenhauer. He doesn't know it yet, but he's about to meet God. Not the Christian God they forced down his throat in childhood. Not the God of pastors and empty promises, but a God of flesh and word of prophet of pessimism. A philosopher who had the courage to speak the naked truth. Life is suffering, and the best we can do is give up on it gracefully. Friedrich Nietzsche buys the book. He takes it home and falls in love with it. Grab your whiskey as we delve deeper into the topic. Why did Nietzsche hate his greatest idol? If you've made it this far, it's because something inside you recognizes this hunger. So do this, subscribe to the channel, not for me, but because you know you need this kind of conversational kind that nobody else dares to have. Schopenhauer once said, "Life swings like a pendulum between pain and boredom." Now tell me, do you disagree? Think about it. You're 21 years old. You're lost. The world doesn't make sense. The people around you live like automatons. They work, eat, sleep, die. Nobody questions anything. And then suddenly you meet someone who says exactly what you feel, but never had the words to express. Someone who says, yes, you're right. Life is absurd. Suffering is inevitable. And no, there is no salvation. Wouldn't you feel relieved? That's exactly what happened with Nietzsche. Schopenhauer wasn't just a philosopher. He was the first honest human being he had ever met. The first one who didn't lie about existence. Let's understand the context. Nietzsche grew up in a stifling Lutheran home, son of a pastor, orphaned at age 5, raised by pious women who lived among Bibles and sighs of Christian resignation. Everything about him screamed religious vocation. Everyone expected him to become a good pastor, a good citizen, a Jawad nobody. But Nietzsche had a problem, he thought. And when you really think, when you really question, the world crumbles. The ready-made answers turn to dust, and you're left there naked, trembling, needing something, anything that makes sense. That's where Schopenhauer came in. Imagine a German philosopher who died just 7 years ago, who had the audacity to say that God doesn't exist. Life has no purpose. And the best thing you can do is deny your own will to live. For a young man stifled by Christian morality, this wasn't nihilism, it was release. Nietzsche devoured. He read, reread, annotated, underlined. He carried the book everywhere, like a Christian carries the Bible, or rather, like an atheist carries his first anti-religious manifesto. Schopenhauer became everything. Mentor, guru, the intellectual father he never had. But here's the brutal, almost comical irony. They never met. Schopenhauer died in 1860. Nietzsche was 16 years old. When young Friedrich discovered the philosopher, 5 years later, he was in love with a ghost. And perhaps that's exactly why the passion was so intense. Because Schopenhauer could not disappoint him. He could not reveal himself to be petty, hypocritical, to human. Schopenhauer was perfect. Because he was dead, it was pure text. Pure idea. Pure ideal. Nietzsche wrote imaginary letters to him. He quoted him, as one quotes, a prophet. He defended him in academic debates with almost religious fervor. The young atheist had found a new god. And, like every god, eventually he would have to die. Because here's the truth that nobody tells you about idols. They need to fall. Not out of malice, not out of ingratitude, but because you can't become who you are while living in someone else's shadow, no matter how great that person is. Nietzsche didn't know this in 1865, but the seed had already been planted. Blind love carries within it the germ of future hatred. Every philosophical passion brings with it its own betrayal. And Schopenhauer, the master of pessimism, the prophet of the negation of life, would teach Nietzsche the most important lesson of all. Not through his words, but through his failure. Schopenhauer was no ordinary philosopher. He was a prophet of Dume German, Buddha, a man who gazed into the abyss of existence and decided that the only sensible response was to give up gracefully. His philosophy can be summarized as follows. The world is blind will, and that will is pure suffering. Translating, you didn't choose to be born. You didn't choose to want. You didn't choose to have desires, hunger, thirst, lust, ambition. All of that is will, a cosmi, irrational, relentless force that uses you as a puppet and discards you when you're no longer useful. You are a pawn, life is a trap. And the reward for existing, more suffering. Because all satisfaction is temporary. You get what you want, you feel pleasure for 5 minutes, and then the will pushes you toward the next desire. On the next, until death. Schopenhauer called this the pendulum of existence. You oscillate between pain when you don't have what you want, and boredom when you finally get it. There is no way out. There is no victory. You always lose. And you know what's worse? He was right. At least partially. At least enough to hook a brilliant 21-year-old who already knew deep down. Always knew that the whole God loves you and everything happens for a reason. Thing was a lie. Nietzsche saw in Schopenhauer the first honest person in his life. Someone who didn't lie to comfort him. Someone who said, yes, life is awful. But at least now, you know, this was not nihilism for the young Nietzsche. It was true, and the truth, however dark it may be, is always better than a comforting lie, or maybe not. Because here's the thing, Schopenhauer didn't stop at analysis. He offered a solution, and that solution was to give up, not literally killing himself, although he thought that would be the logical option if it weren't for natural human cowardice, but giving up, spiritually denying the will, becoming living like a Buddhist monk, without desires, without passions, without the will to live. Art, he said, offers temporary relief, a few moments of pure contemplation where you forget you exist. But in the end, the only real solution is to fade out, to become nothing. A Nietzsche, young, passionate, desperate for answers, bought into this idea of body and soul. He wrote essays defending Schopenhauer. He debated with colleagues. He became a disciple. He became a preacher of philosophical pessimism. Because, you see, when you're lost, any map seems better than no map at all, even if that map leads to the precipice. And that is exactly what Schopenhauer offered. An elegant, well-argued, logically impeccable map that led straight to the abyss. Nietzsche followed this map for years. He defended it. He loved it until the day he realized this map is a fraud. Not because the assumptions were wrong, but because the conclusion was cowardly. Schopenhauer had diagnosed the disease with surgical precision. But the cure he offered, it was spiritual suicide disguised as wisdom. And Nietzsche, who didn't even quite know who he was yet, began to feel something stirring inside him. Anger, a suspicion, a betrayal is brewing. Because if life is suffering, if existence is absurd, if the world is blind and cruel will, why on earth would the answer be to give up? Why not to affirm? Why not to hug? Why not to try to embrace chaos, pain, and tragedy end to extract something great, something beautiful, something worthwhile from it? Schopenhauer said, life is suffering. So deny life, and Nietzsche began to whisper to himself, life is suffering. So what? That question would change everything. But not yet. Not yet. For the time being, Nietzsche remained a faithful disciple. He still believed that his pessimistic master was the voice of wisdom. I hadn't yet realized that Schopenhauer wasn't a wise man. He was just a frightened man pretending to have answers. Nietzsche didn't do things halfway. When he loved with everything. And when he hated, and Schopenhauer needed to be destroyed. Not for personal revenge, the man was dead. Remember? But because his philosophy was a cultural virus that infected brilliant minds and convinced them that the best answer to life was not to live. So Nietzsche took up arms, philosophical weapons. And the war began. The first bombshell he dropped was the concept of amor, fati, love of destiny. If Schopenhauer said, deny your will, deny your desires, deny life, Nietzsche replied, love your destiny. Love every moment. Love even the pain, even the chaos, even the absurdity. It wasn't cheap optimism. It wasn't a motivational coach positivity. It was something much more radical, accepting life exactly as she is, cruel, unfair, pointless, and yet Nietzsche wrote, "My formula for greatness in humankind is amor fati, wanting nothing different, whether in the past, in the future, or throughout eternity. Not merely enduring what is necessary, but loving it." Do you understand what he's saying? He's saying, don't run from pain. Don't deny suffering. Don't become a cowardly ascetic who thinks giving up on life is wisdom. Embrace everything, pain, chaos, tragedy. Transform that into fuel for your own greatness. This was not merely a philosophical response to Schopenhauer. It was a declaration of existential war. And Nietzsche didn't stop there. He created the Superman, the Overman, the one who surpasses himself, who creates his own values, who doesn't need metaphysical or religious crutches to endure existence. The Übermensch is the opposite, exact love, the Schopenhauerianist, where the ascetic denies life, the Übermensch says. Where the ascetic flees from instincts, the Übermensch. Where the ascetic seeks nothingness, the Übermensch seeks constant overcoming. And then Nietzsche went even further. He took Schopenhauer's most central concept, the will as blind suffering, and turned it upside down. He created the will to power, no longer will as a cosmic curse, but will as creative, expansive, affirming impulse, desire to grow, to overcome, to create. Schopenhauer saw the will and thought, this condemns us. Nietzsche saw the same will and thought, this sets us free. Because the will to power isn't about dominating others, although many people have misunderstood that. It's about dominating himself. It's about transformation. It's about taking the raw material of your existence and sculpting something great. This is Nietzsche's answer to the question, if life has no meaning given by God, what do we do? Response, we created our own meaning, and we became great in the process. This was philosophical dynamite, and Nietzsche knew it. He wrote in Behold the Man, one of his last books, written shortly before his mind collapsed, something devastating about Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer misinterpreted genius. To do so, he must have misinterpreted himself. Translating, Schopenhauer thought that denying life was genius, but it was merely weakness in disguise. He was mistaken about what it means to be great, and he built an entire philosophy from this self-deception. Nietzsche wasn't just disagreeing, he was saying, you lied to yourself and to all of us. And then came the final, most brutal critique. Nietzsche called Schopenhauer perceived nihilist, someone who sees the emptiness of existence and gives up, crumbles, becomes an ascetic, seeks nothingness. And he became what we call active nihilist, who sees the emptiness of existence and says, perfect. Now I can create my own values. Now I am free to become who I want to be. What's the difference between the two? Schopenhauer was a defeated man who philosophized about his defeat. Nietzsche was a warrior who transformed defeat into victory. And you know what's most ironic? Nietzsche wouldn't have existed without Schopenhauer. He needed pessimism as a springboard. He needed nihilism as raw material. He needed the negation of life to create affirmation of life. Schopenhauer was the necessary teacher, the mentor who needed to be surpassed, the father who needed to be killed so that his son could be born, and Nietzsche killed him mercilessly, not with blind rage, but with the surgical precision of someone who knows exactly what they're doing. He said goodbye to pessimism, goodbye to denial, goodbye to fear disguised as wisdom, and he embraced the chaos. There's an uncomfortable truth about growing up. You can't become who you are without betraying who you were. And you definitely can't become who you are while you worship someone else. Nietzsche learned this the hard way. He loved Schopenhauer. He idolized him. He defended him against the whole world. And then he had to destroy him. Not out of malice, not out of ingratitude, but why had to be born. And in order to be born, the son must kill the father. Not literally, of course, but symbolically, philosophically, existentially. As long as you are living in the shadow of another person, no matter how great they are, no matter how brilliant they are not living, you are imitation is not life. It's an echo. It's a reflection. It's death in life. Schopenhauer was Nietzsche's intellectual father, and Nietzsche did what every courageous son needs to do. He killed his father so that he could exist fully. He wrote, "One repays a teacher poorly when one remains merely a student." Do you understand? To be a disciple forever is to betray the master. Because the true master doesn't want clones. He wants you to be overcome. And what if the master doesn't want that? Then he's not a master. He's just someone afraid of being surpassed. Schopenhauer never wanted to be surpassed. He wanted to be the final prophet, the last philosopher, the one who discovered the ultimate truth that life should be denied. But Nietzsche refused to be the last disciple of a dead philosophy. So he betrayed, and in betraying, he freed himself. And here's the part nobody tells you about this story. Nietzsche would never have existed without Schopenhauer. Think about it. If young Friedrich had never found that book in the Leipzig bookstore, if he had never fallen in love with pessimism, if he had never plunged so deeply into the negation of life, he would never have created the affirmation of life. The Übermensch was born out of hatred for the ascetic. Amor fati was born from disgust at negation. The will to power was born from the rejection of resignation. Schopenhauer was the necessary soil, the dark, putrid fertilizer where the Nietzschean plant could grow. You cannot create light without knowing darkness. You cannot affirm without first denying. You cannot become strong without first knowing weakness. And Schopenhauer was weakness personified. The perfect nihilist, the eloquent coward, the man who had the courage to diagnose a disease, but not the strength to cure it. Nietzsche needed him precisely for that reason. Because every hero needs a villain, and every son needs a father to kill. But here's the final twist. The cruel irony that makes this whole story even more profound. Nietzsche never completely escaped Schopenhauer, no matter how much he fought against him, no matter how much he criticized him, no matter how much he built an entire philosophy in opposition to him. The shadow was there. It always had been, because when you define your life against them, you are still being defined. Bewit someone. Nietzsche spent years shouting yes to life, but he only shouted so loudly because he could still hear Schopenhauer whispering no in his ear. He built cathedrals of affirmation, but he built them upon ruins of negation. And perhaps, just perhaps, this isn't a weakness. Perhaps that is precisely what makes Nietzsche great. Because he didn't pretend the denial didn't exist. He didn't pretend the suffering wasn't real. He didn't ignore the abyss. He looked into the abyss, the same abyss Schopenhauer saw, and said something completely different. Yes, I see you. I recognize you. And yet, I choose life. That's real courage. Not the courage to ignore the horror, but the courage to face it head on. And even so to affirm. And do you have that courage? Because here's the ultimate truth, the brutal lesson that this story teaches us. We all have a Schopenhauer in us. It could be a philosopher, it could be a father, it could be a mentor, a teacher, a friend, an ideology, a religion, someone or something you idolize so much that you've forgotten to think for yourself. Someone whose shadow is so large that you cannot see their own light. And as long as you have that idol, you don't have your own philosophy. You have a borrowed religion, and any religion, even philosophical ones, is a prison. Nietzsche destroyed his idol, and in destroying it, he freed himself. Not completely, never completely, because we always carry our influences, our ghosts, our shadows, but he freed himself enough to create, to become who he was, to tell the world, I am not Schopenhauer. I am not a disciple of anyone. I am Nietzsche, and this is my philosophy. And now, the important question. Who is your Schopenhauer? And you have the courage to betray him. Because as long as you don't betray, you aren't born. You only echo and echoes don't change the world. Only one's own voice can do that. So take a deep breath, look at your idols, and ask yourself, do they set me free or imprison me? The answer will hurt. It always hurts. But pain is the price of birth. And you, like Nietzsche, need to decide. Do you want to live in someone's shadow forever? Either you have the courage to kill your father and finalito exist. The choice is yours. It always has been. Empty whiskey. Fill your glass. The next abyss awaits you. Subscribe to the channel.